You see, they are a young man getting some expert advice from Santa, no doubt, and we are very happy that our first guest is here to give us some expert advice on money matters. Tonight we have an economics indicator section. I'm Jerry Lyons. This is News and Views, and this gentleman is Richard Hall, BottomLine Lawyers. Sir, always a pleasure, counselor, to see you.
Thanks, Jerry.
Now, the top story, of course, tonight is the inclement weather that is right outside the door, and Mr. Hall has asked to be able to give out some pointers to people since he is concerned with people's safety and is also very active with the Auburn Chamber and has also been very aware of some of the things that are going on regarding the law and accidents and the kinds of things that can make you liable to have them, as well as liable if someone else has one. So you wanted to mention some things, sir, please?
Just a couple of brief things. One is whether you believe this is going to be a huge storm or not, everyone is urging the public to really be smart about being exposed to the weather and not create situations which take up the precious time of first responders. We need them for important activities and not for slushing people out of cars where they manage to walk through the water or drive through the water and stall out the car. Yeah. So just be smart about those things. The other one is in terms of being informed about what's going on. There's 3 counties, Placer, Sacramento, and Yolo, which have all teamed up to have a public service like a reverse 911 call. And you can go in Placer County, for instance, to www.placer-alert.org. That's placer-alert.org, and there you can sign up, and they'll send you text messages or a phone call if you want of developments that are specific to your area. You can actually list 3 different locations that you wanted to track. And recently, I think you mentioned when we had those shootings that were in Auburn, my office is very close to that, about a block away. Yeah. And I got multiple messages from the sheriff's department, which was really handy because it let you know exactly what's going on. I was able to, help my staff be safe, lock down the doors and close windows. So anyway, I urge folks to take advantage of that.
It is a very good system. In fact, I like the idea that we even have the Amber Alerts now. You can get right through your phone, and it just helps people be able to not only help themselves, but also to look out for things that are helpful to law enforcement. I'm all for that. You need to take a proactive toward that. I'm a big fan of Crime Stoppers. Yeah. And that kind of work.
Great program. Absolutely.
So what's going on in the legal biz?
Well, the other thing I wanted to mention is I recently completed a jury trial of the Santucci Justice Center, and it renewed my appreciation for the folks that are willing to serve as jurors. It takes up time, and it's a commitment on their part, but it really does make our justice system work. It is what makes the U.S. different from many countries in the world. And so these folks, they show up, and you get summoned for jury duty, and lots of people ask for excuses from jury duty for various reasons. But a lot of people actually go on and serve on a jury. I've always wanted to, but as an attorney, I've never gotten called. Right. Anyway, just wanted to have an opportunity to say thank you to those people who actually serve as jurors. It's critical to our system, and really appreciate it.
I can tell you a brief funny story about that, perhaps, that make you realize a lot of people are a little bit trepidatious about wanting to do this because, as you said, it takes up time. We had a case. I was on a case. I was a juror one time, and it was alleged DUI. It turned out the police didn't really have any evidence. I mean, there was no case. So it took only like 3 days. Presentation of evidence, statements, etc., wrap up. And it was really interesting to see how the court works. It's a lot more complicated than you expect. But I think the way that it's now explained, the judge took several places in the procedure to explain what was going on, and it looked like things that were made to be read as scripts to inform people on how the system works.
Sure, jury instructions and all those.
And I found that was really a great help because you go to these things, you don't know what to expect. It's a little nerve-wracking at times. It's a great instructional thing, though. You really get to learn.
It is, and it's when I get to observe, I haven't been a juror, but observe trials, you really see how people work, and you can see how people are telling the truth or perhaps not telling the truth. Yeah. And in the jury, that's exactly the role. The judge is in charge of the law. He decides what the law says, or she does. and the jury's in charge of the facts, and they decide what's true and what's not true, and that's the way that works. So anyway, again, thanks to those people who actually do serve. Appreciate it.
If I may ask, and of course, you know, you can always, since these might be professionally important things for you to keep close to your vest, because they deal with technique and also being able to be effective at making sure that justice is done. During voir dire, when you have to help in the selection process, can a judge overrule your choice to either have an exemption of that person or ask them to serve?
In short, no. You're allowed what are called peremptory challenges.
Yes.
And you get a specific number of challenges. In the recent trial, we had a total of 8 challenges on the defense side and 8 challenges on the plaintiff side. And you don't need a reason. You can say, I don't like the color of shirt they're wearing, and thank and excuse that juror. But the more important ones are when you're excusing a juror for cause. And so voir dire is intended to expose any prejudice or bias that a juror potentially could have with respect to this case. And then if they're excused for cause, then you're not using up a peremptory challenge.
Right.
So it's a pretty good system. There are jury consultants. And on a big case, they bring in jury consultants and evaluate the psychology, and they'll say, well, because this juror said this, that means they probably believe that, and you know, they draw a lot of extrapolation and conclusions out of that. I'm not sure I personally put a lot of weight in it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, what most of us as trial attorneys do is evaluate people. You make a judgment on somebody as to how they'll participate in the jury and what they'll do on your particular case, whether there's going to be a bias there or not. And that's very intangible. So, you know, I think the jury analysts have a place.
Yeah.
You know, but it's an interesting process.
I'm not going to ask you how you can tell whether somebody is telling the truth or not, because that's part of your stock and trade. But I will say that John Grisham wrote a really great book and was made a terrific film, Runaway Jury. And there's an awful lot in there that people can glean about this process that you're talking about. And I'm sure that social media has made it almost impossible for anybody who's up for jury duty to say, well, they've never heard of this crime in their area. I mean, now it's on Facebook, it's on emails, it's on their watch, it's on their phone.
Yeah. It might even be in their eyeglasses.
Google Glasses.
Google Glasses,
I mean, that must be very difficult these days to, you're not able to just take somebody out of the equation because they've heard about a case in their neighborhood.
Well, and the mere fact that somebody's heard about it doesn't necessarily mean they have a bias in that regard.
Yeah.
So that's what the trick is, to get to whether or not there really is a bias. And that's an art form.
Yeah.
You know, not a science, but it is an art form.
I want to mention also that Mr. Hall mentors small businesses. He works very closely with the Auburn Chamber of Commerce. You are a past president, and you're currently on the Board of Trustees for the next couple of weeks.
Board of Directors, I'm termed out at the end of this year. We do have term limits for the Board of...
Well, thank you for your service. That's quite commendable.
It's been great. And I get to work on the Government Affairs and Economic Development Committee this coming year for the Chamber, so that'll be fun too.
Okay. What else do you have to tell us about in the legal business?
I wanted to tell you about one interesting development, and that is in a recent bankruptcy case, the city of Stockton, Judge Klein, who's the presiding judge in the Eastern District, made a ruling that in a Chapter 11 proceeding, or Chapter 12 proceeding for a municipality, they can actually do what's called cram down pensions. That is to say, they can, if your pension was supposed to pay you $5,000 a month, they can change it so it pays you $4,000 a month.
Right.
And that's a really important ruling, and an extremely well thought out ruling. And the interesting impact of that is, in Stockton, they didn't cram down any pensions. They worked very hard to put together a exit plan that would allow them to avoid that. And then shortly thereafter, Detroit did the same thing. When they filed their plan, it didn't include a cram down on the pensions. And that is being challenged by some investors. that they think they're being treated unfairly because they got crammed down, but pensioners didn't. But I think that Judge Klein's ruling is going to hold up to scrutiny, and that is going to influence what happens on bankruptcy cases. And I thought that's important for individuals who might watch this show to know, because a lot of people collect retirement funds.
Yeah.
And I think they should feel reasonably confident that they're going to continue to collect those in the amounts that they are currently collecting them. I think that's my reading of all those developments.
I see.
Yeah. So I think it's a pretty interesting thing for folks to be aware of.
I think it was announced today or yesterday in Detroit that apparently the last hurdle has been cleared by the judge. The plan is all there, and the person, I don't know who you would call, a court-appointed trustee for the city, or the financial expert that's adjutant to the court.
In this case, it's actually a creditors committee. There's a whole bunch of creditors, and they serve on a committee that decides from the creditor's point of view what ought to happen. And then there's the advocacy between the attorneys who represent the municipality or Detroit and the attorneys that represent the creditors. And
so their work is almost done now.
Their work is almost done.
That's great.
Yeah. So their plan is, I think, been approved now, and so it's now a point of implementation. Mm-hmm. And everybody walks away. Most creditors took a haircut, but they're not getting completely bereft of any return.
What is the creditor's major argument, I would think, is that a pension plan is a kind of a contract. You promise your employees if they invest so much, or if they work so many years, that they will get this much return. So I would kind of wonder why the court would automatically say, well, that contract is invalid. Why would they say that?
Well, they won't say it's invalid, but in a reorganization proceeding, whether it's an 11 for a company or a 12 for a municipality, all contracts get reviewed, and all contracts can be what's called impaired.
Okay.
And so, you borrowed $500 million from Bank of America, and the court can say, well, that's now worth $50 million. And as long as all creditors are being treated fairly and equally, the creditor doesn't have anything to say about that. That's what the power of bankruptcy is. And people, since we're talking about bankruptcy, probably useful to point out that bankruptcy is actually called the Fresh Start Law, and it was never created as an act of kindness or anything of the sort. It's very self-interested. It recognizes that companies and individuals, if they were to start businesses, have losses, and could never get out from underneath that if something goes wrong, they'd never start another business.
Right.
Right. Well, as an economy, we can't afford to have that. We need to have people that are willing to take a risk. And we have lots of them. They take risks, they make lots of money. And occasionally, people take a risk and they fail. And that's what the bankruptcy code is about, actually, is helping those folks so that they will stay in the game and produce more businesses and more jobs that run the economy.
I'm not familiar with the history behind that code, but has it got anything to do with the Great Depression? Was it created in the aftermath of the Great Depression to get America back working again?
Well, the bankruptcy code itself actually was rewritten in, I think, about 1985, and it's been through several iterations. It wasn't formally called the bankruptcy code at one point, but it's really existed since Abe Lincoln's time. I mean, Abe Lincoln took advantage of an aspect of bankruptcy. And I actually do a little videotape on my website about famous bankruptcies. Yeah. And all the people that have declared bankruptcy. Even Walt Disney's declared bankruptcy.
Yes, he did when he first started. Yes.
And lots of other famous people recognized have filed bankruptcy. And it goes to reinforce the notion that it is about getting a fresh start and encouraging people to take a risk.
Mr. Hershey did too.
Yes.
Creator of Hershey, Pennsylvania, and the Hershey Bar. Hershey
Bar, yeah. The whole city named after Hershey, right?
He ain't broke now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a city that's gone through some changes as well.
I've been through there.
Yeah.
The amazing thing is, though, I think a lot of people don't know some of the backstory is that, well, Mr. Hershey learned a very valuable and hard lesson. But after that, there was a company store And that's where, if you were an employee of Hershey, you bought everything.
Was it Tennessee Ernie Ford sang that song about the company store? Yeah.
16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and
deeper in debt. Yeah.
Sold my soul at the company store.
Yeah. Exactly.
And you also have, I must mention your practice, BottomLine Lawyers. You're located on Hill Street, is it?
High Street.
High Street.
High Street, across from the fairgrounds in Auburn.
So you go to bottomlinelawyers.com and you will see some videos that Mr. Hall has put together to explain his practice. You will also see the kinds of cases that he takes on. So you specialize in...
well, I can't use the word specialize. That's restricted by the bar.
You've already told me this.
I do focus. I focus on real estate and business and bankruptcy and taxation.
Okay.
Yeah.
You did warn me about that once.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And estate planning.
And how is business in all of these quadrants?
It's good. Bankruptcies are certainly off substantially from where they were a couple of years ago, as you would imagine. We're not going through the same kind of foreclosures and all those sorts of things that we did that prompted so many bankruptcies. But that's a steady business, and folks still run into problems for whatever reason. Actually, the number one reason that people file bankruptcy is for medical expenses.
Yes.
And you get hit with an illness and you can't cover it. You got to do something.
Yes.
So, but that's doing well. It's end of the year, so people are very interested in estate planning. This is the time of year where people begin to think about, well, what do I do about this? What do I do about gift giving? What's my bequest going to be? That sort of thing. Real estate is a very interesting practice area right now because things are starting to pick up again in real estate, and so there are transactional difficulties. People have misrepresented a property or a circumstance, and had a case like that which we recently settled. And then taxation is very interesting. People with large-scale tax issues, they owe a couple $100,000 in taxes, mostly to the IRS. And part of that's at the tail end of the recession. When the recession hit, there were people who were making some substantial incomes, and they're independent contractors or they're businesses, and so they may or may not have paid quarterlies. Mm-hmm. And so they get out to the end of the year, and their practice had been, well, I'll make some more money next year, and I'll pay last year's taxes. Well, then the music stopped, and there was no chair, so there was no new money coming in, and so they got behind on taxes. And then people tend to ignore that. I mean, for a long time, everybody said, well, this recession is just going to be, it's going to be short. It'll be over in a year. It'll be over in 18 months, and that was 2007. This is 2014, and we still are feeling the effects of it. So, so people have been hanging on to these tax issues, and now they're catching up with them. IRS is catching up with them, and they got to find ways to work out of those problems. And so, a lot of people, for instance, don't know that you can file bankruptcy on some taxes under some circumstances.
Oh, because I thought that they were always exempt.
No, there's a lot of complicated rules about when you can discharge taxes in bankruptcy. But even if you can't discharge them, you could go into a reorganization and you can limit the penalties, interest, and spread out the payments. So there's a lot of different approaches to it within the IRS and the mechanisms with the collection due process or offer and compromise or all those different things, or in bankruptcy. And then there's always just sort of a debt resolution possibility. Normally it's an offer and compromise with the IRS, but there are some other ways to do that. So that's kind of what the practice is, and those areas are moving along nicely, and interestingly, actually, a lot of developments there. Mm-hmm. But I look at the overall economy, and there's some red flags out there that trouble me a little bit. I don't have any crystal ball sitting here, so I can't prognosticate exactly what's going to happen, but I can just share with you some things that I've seen, and one of them is the level of income required to pay rents. There's a survey recently throughout the United States of the percent of your income required to pay your rent, and it identified 10 metropolitan areas throughout the United States where the rent money was more than 30% of income. And that's unusual. I mean, if you look at a lender's guidelines for buying a house, that they think you should be spending no more than 33%, and a third is ideal. And of those 10 that were identified, 6 of them are in California.
Gee, oh
Yeah.
boy.
One of them is Sacramento, which
Yeah.
was at 32%, so it wasn't so enormous. But another one, actually, everybody, if I were just going to ask you offhand, what city would you think?
San Francisco?
That's what I would think too. It wasn't. It was
Oh.
Los Angeles at 47%.
Really?
47% of income was required to pay rent.
That's tremendously
So,
high.
so set that aside for just a moment, and let me share another statistic with you, and then we'll talk about what the possibilities are. Historically, in California at least, and I think throughout the country, when you went to buy a house, that the cost of that house was generally 2 to 3 times what your annual salary was. That's been a sort of a rule of thumb, as you would, for many years in California. But in recent years, that number has gone up dramatically. And currently, today, it's at 6.06. So you take your annual income, multiply 6.06, and that's what the median cost of a house is. Wow. And you look at those two circumstances together, and it's alarming because if people are spending that percentage of their income on housing, it means they're not spending it on other consumer goods that drive the economy. And related to that is we have more and more students graduating with significant student debt. And if a student is paying student loans and they're paying, you know, a couple $1,000, $3,000 a month for a student loan, they can't possibly afford to buy a house. Well, if they can't buy a house, who's going to be the entry-level market that pushes the housing market along?
Right.
And so, you know, again, I don't have a crystal ball, don't know exactly where that'll all shake out, but those two facts taken together, since housing is the most significant expenditure for virtually all households, a few exceptions on that, it's troubling. It's very troubling to see where that might go. So we'll just have to sort of sit tight and watch that, pay careful attention to that.
Anecdotally, I remember when my two brothers got out of college, and that was one of the first things they wanted to save up for, is to get a home, and my father and mother helped them out. My brother Tom still lives in the same house he moved into more than 50 years ago in Connecticut, and that was, you know, their big success story. But I know that there are people who, some other friends of mine, they're in their 40s and they're just buying their first home. It's not like they're 21 where they just got out of college and do it.
Sure.
I'm wondering if there's a caution about the mortgage meltdown that happened years ago.
There is, but I don't think we necessarily learned from it, because we are back to 100% financing in a lot of cases. And we still have situations where banks are able to loan money, repackage that, sell it, and not have any skin in the game. So they don't have any real risk in it. So that's kind of a repeat of what we had 2007, 2008. And it's certainly tighter than it was. I mean, there was a time where the joke was, if you could fog a mirror, you can get a loan, right?
Right, yeah.
And that was largely true. That's not the case. We haven't gone full circle back to that, but it credit has loosened up substantially from where it was.
Do you think the economy is really proceeding as well as it should? I heard something on the radio today where they predict that next year the economy will move a lot quicker than it is this last year. This last year, I think it's only something like 2.1% or something. Whereas next year they predict it's going to be more than 3.1%. And I'm wondering, is that really true? Do you see that reflected in the kinds of problems that people come to you to solve?
Yeah, to some extent, but I would have this admonition, and I'll probably get shot for it. But really, if you want to know what's going on in the economy, turn off Fox, turn off MSNBC, and do some reading, right? Because on the major networks, all you're getting is pablum, in my opinion. You're not getting any real analysis. You're getting the top of the story and not any detailed story. And, you know, you can read the Wall Street Journal, and at least you're going to get a lot more information there. Personally, I'm a fan of the Christian Science Monitor.
Yes, very good.
Because it's got excellent political reporting that's pretty neutral, and it's got excellent economic reporting. And The Economist out of London is a good rag for economic data that is reasonably reliable. And you can make your own decisions. And I think that's think that's one of the challenges that we have in our media culture, is that people want to have an easy answer, so they look and see whatever their favorite flavor of TV is, and they'll listen to that, and that's the answer, as opposed to doing the hard work of looking at the data and thinking it through for themselves. So.
Well, that's the reason I started this section called Economic Indicators, get experts like you in a variety of professions and parts of industry and say, okay, let's forget about the headlines. What are you yourself experiencing in your field that acts as an indicator for the economy, and how does it change the way you do business?
Absolutely. I mean, in my practice is a good example. I told you bankruptcies were way down, but actually in the last 90 days, they've started to creep up again. And but the nature of the problems are not so much housing related now. It's more traditional things, whether it's medical or taxes or whatever.
Yes.
But more traditional bankruptcy type issues. But they're rising, and a lot of it is a result of unemployment. I had one client come in, and she had been working in the Bay Area but living in Auburn, so she spent her week in the city. And making a substantial six-figure job. Wow. And they said, oh, by the way, we don't need you anymore. Well, when your whole life is built around that and you can't go replace that directly, that's a huge problem. And so those folks have to accommodate in some way. Bankruptcy is frequently a tool that gets used that way.
Right.
So
we have a few moments, and before we started talking, before we started the show, you wanted to mention some. If David Letterman would do this portion, the top 10 things not to tell the judge when you're looking for mercy in a bankruptcy case. Does that kind of sum it up?
Well, I like these. These are kind of fun. These are really the truth about frivolous tax arguments. Since I've been doing a lot more tax work, what people have come up with, and the number one problem that I've encountered is people not filing returns at all.
Yeah.
And when they do that, a couple of things happen. One, the IRS frequently will file what's called an SFR, a substitute for return. And when they do that, all they do is pick out all the income stuff that gets reported on a 1099 or a W-2 and pile it all up and say that's you owe money, and they don't take into consideration any kind of deductions or anything else. And so those tax bills are real whoppers. And when you don't file, you can't take advantage of the many programs the IRS has to take care of delinquent taxes, whether it's an offer in compromise or a collection due process or appeal to the tax court or whatever, the innocent spouse, whatever the issues are, you don't have access to that because you haven't filed a return. It's like if you're not in the game, you don't get to take advantage of the rules, right? And so people don't do that, and they have all kinds of reasons for that. And I have this document that's called The Truth About Frivolous Tax Arguments, and why people don't file. So one of the arguments that people make is that the filing of a tax return is voluntary. And there's a long, sort of complicated constitutional argument about that. But it's been thoroughly debunked by the Supreme Court and other courts. And well, people say, well, the Constitution doesn't authorize it. Well, the Constitution says that the Supreme Court will make these decisions. They've decided. And the decision was, yes, you do have to file. Then the other one, I've got about 10 of them that I think are particularly interesting, but here's payment of federal income tax is voluntary. Well, because it's not something you're required to do, but the courts again have cleared up that perhaps confusion. And it's a quote, the person so required shall pay such taxes. It wasn't may or ought to, or it'd be nice if they did. It said they shall pay.
It's law, yeah.
And so people don't file because of that. They assert those reasons. Another technique that people have tried is they reduce their tax liability by filing a zero return. They essentially said, well, I didn't really make any money. Even though they have $100,000 of W-2 income, they didn't make any money.
Okay.
And again, Kelly versus United States is probably the leading case in that regard. But it says a zero, the fact that you filed a zero return does not make it so.
Hence the invention of the audit.
Yes, exactly. Oh, and by the way, did I mention, yes. This is a pretty clever one, actually. I like this. It says, wages, tips, and other compensation received for personal services are not income. Well, they're not income because I exchanged my labor for this money. So really, I didn't gain anything. I lost my labor, and I got the money, and so therefore, I don't have any income.
I see.
You can imagine where that argument went. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think it went very far.
In a hurry, as a matter of fact. This is another one that's really interesting because it ties into several other arguments that have been made about the monetary system, and basically the contention is that the Federal Reserve notes are not income. So in other words, Federal Reserve note, that's your dollar bill, $5 bill, whatever it is, that they're not income. And this one I thought was pretty interesting. In an opinion affirming a conviction for willfully failing to file a return and rejecting the argument that Federal Reserve notes are not subject to taxation, the court stated that the Congress has declared Federal Reserve notes are legal tender.
It says they're legal tender on the bill.
Well, yeah, but
to pay all debts, public and private.
That's exactly what it says. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, couple more if we have time.
Yes, sir, we do.
The taxpayer is not a citizen of the United States and thus is not subject to federal income tax. Hey, I'm not a citizen. I'm maybe naturalized. Maybe I'm a foreigner, so I don't have to pay this tax. Well, yeah, that didn't go over too well either. And some people actually rejected their citizenship in the thought that they could actually avoid taxation.
Nah.
Not so much, huh? Not so much. Okay, this is one of my favorites. The United States consists only of the District of Columbia, the federal territories, and federal enclaves. The states aren't part of the United States. That's the argument. And they're not part of the United States because the states are sovereign. So they can't be part of the United States, right? Well, again, you can imagine, excuse me, where that went. But in U.S. versus Conlon and several other cases, it was decided that the states really are part of the United States, and so you do have to pay taxes.
Yeah, some things are sovereign, but not everything. And one of the things that's the trade-off is the states get to do certain things, but the federal government reserves its right to make collection of debts for the security and defense of the country and other things.
Well, and why that argument is so interesting is because it was one of the items that was debated at the Constitutional Convention, specifically that, well, wait a minute, we're not going to give you the authority to tax. Oh, yes, you are, or we're not forming a union.
Right.
And that's kind of the way that went. Here's another one. The taxpayer is not a person as defined by the Internal Revenue Code, and therefore is not subject to federal income tax law. So if you're not a person, I guess you don't have to pay taxes. And that tied into a bunch of approaches where people were then forming a personal corporation and saying,
right.
I'm not a person, I'm a corporation, so I don't have
right.
to pay those taxes.
Corporation is a fictional identity.
Which, ironically, the Supreme Court has decided is the same as a person, because they give it all the same protections and rights as a person. Okay.
Interesting.
Taxpayers can refuse to pay income taxes on religious or moral grounds by invoking the First Amendment. This was pretty popular about, I guess, 15, 20 years ago, something like that. It was especially popular during the Vietnam War. And people were saying that I don't support the war, so I'm not paying taxes. And some people even went to the extent of saying, well, the portion of taxes that go to support the war are X, and therefore my tax liability is $1,000, we'll say, and I'm only going to give you 68% of it because 32% goes to support the war.
Right.
And whether it's religious or moral reasons, the Supreme Court has made it clear, no, that's not an acceptable excuse for not paying taxes. Another one, taxpayers do not have to file returns or provide financial information because of the protection against self-incrimination in the Fifth Amendment. So if you tell the IRS that you made this money, you could get in trouble, and therefore that's self-incrimination. That didn't hold much water, as you can imagine.
Let me ask you a question, if I may. The reason why you sign the tax form that you submit is kind of an affidavit saying, okay, what I'm telling you here is a true bill.
Yes.
But if you have a question about it, can you not get a tax hearing to determine whether the $100,000 that you made is all taxable income? Can you do it that way?
You can. It's usually what happens, you're going to get an opinion from a couple of tax professionals, and you're going to file the return, and the tax professional is going to add an addendum which explains their thought process on it,
Okay.
and the justification for the position they took. And then the IRS is going to evaluate it. And I've seen that go both ways, where people that had quite legitimate analyses and positions, that it went right through without any issue. And others that took a more extreme or less supportable view got taken to task by the IRS. It doesn't actually protect you against penalties or interest per se. You're still going to have that problem, but it's certainly going to protect you against any accusation of willful conduct on your part. I mean, you said, hey, this is what I think, and this is why I'm doing it.
Right.
You know, so unless it was completely obvious, like I'm you know, deducting something that was, I can't even think of something crazy enough, but you know, unless it's in a completely irrational tax maneuver, it's going to protect you from any such accusation.
You still have to file the return, in other words, your report of your income, and you still have to sign it.
Right.
And then let's go from there,
right,
in case you have a question or a problem.
Right.
Okay.
And then you can go to tax court to appeal a decision if there is one. You can do a collection due process hearing. There's a lot of avenues that you can take. You could even just plain old meet with a revenue officer and chat with them about it and see if you can work it out or compromise it in some way.
Right.
Compelled compliance with the federal income tax laws is a form of servitude and is in violation of the 13th Amendment against involuntary servitude. That's another one of those arguments that came and went, but they've all had their time. And on each of these, it's not like, well, one person out of 200 million brought this up. No, there's cases and cases and cases where people tried to advance that particular argument.
Okay.
The federal income tax laws are unconstitutional. This is when you were talking about earlier before the show, because the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution was not properly ratified. And the argument there was that Ohio was, although it ratified the Constitution, it wasn't legitimately a state at that point in time. Later, the Supreme Court ruled that Ohio was a state, retroactive to 1803 at the time that the laws were passed. So that was sort of an interesting thing.
That's all the time we have, sir.
Okay. Well, then I won't go any further other than to say the rule that you can garner from all these examples is that the IRS is going to win if you're making spurious arguments.
I want you to come back and finish this up after the new year if you want. I'd love to hear the rest of this.
Yeah.
This is very good.
There's a bunch of them. They're really interesting and amusing. And I'll bring some more names about famous bankruptcies. That's always entertaining too.
I'm sorry about the time constraints, but
not at all.
I'd love to hear you talk.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much, Jerry.
BottomLineLawyers.com is the place to go. Also, you can go to AuburnChamber.net, visit there, see all the wonderful services, and some of these are offered by Mr. Hall. That you can get if you are a member of the Auburn Chamber or if you want to join. You don't have to be an Auburn business owner. You can be a business owner anywhere and join the Auburn Chamber. That's the beauty of that.
Jerry, one more thing I wanted to mention.
Of course.
This list, if anybody wants a copy of it, they can send an email to me at info@bottomlinelawyers.com, and I'll be happy to email them a copy of it.
info@bottomlinelawyers.com.
For the truth about frivolous tax arguments.
We don't want to get frivolous in front of His Honor.
Yes.
I want to wish you and your family and all of your partners and everybody in your business a very happy holidays. You folks work very hard to help people in trouble. You've done an awful lot of pro bono work, and you're to be commended for that.
Thanks so much.
And also your service to all the people who are part of the Auburn Chamber, including Wave Broadband. We're a proud member of the Auburn Chamber, and we're very glad that you are there looking out for all of us members.
Yeah, and we appreciate Wave's support.
We're very happy to do it, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk to Dan Britton, who is the next generation pastor of the Crossroads Church right down here in Rockham. We're going to be welcoming some young people who are going to talk about the importance of this teen center that you probably have seen. Hot chili cool cars. They have big pancake breakfast there the Boy Scouts have. But there's a lot more that goes on at that teen center, and we're going to have that for you in just a moment. Stay with us.
For your next family party or community fundraiser, hold your event in an historic Loomis setting, the South Placer Heritage Foundation's Blue Goose Event Center. The event center was the setting for the Blue Goose Food Extravaganza, and Loomis Basin has talent. The 10,000 square foot space offers seating for 400 or more, a catering kitchen, a stage with sound system and theatrical lighting, a bonus room and a green room. And you can book this historic setting for birthday, anniversary, and wedding parties. Contact the Blue Goose Event Center now.
This is Senior Chaplain Terry Morgan of Gold Country Chaplaincy. Thanks to your generous support, our recent Veteran Stand-Down in Roseville was a great success. We received so many gifts of clothing and supplies from all over the country, we were able to store some for veterans' future needs. And veterans came from far and wide to receive free counseling, medical, dental, and financial assistance. We thank you and the many volunteers who help us serve veterans, who have served us in so many ways.